Okay, welcome back everyone to the inaugural conference of the Society of Christian Bioethicists. We're very excited and very honoured today to have Professor Peter Singer and Professor Charles Camosy here for our keynote panel discussion. I'll give a quick run over the bios. Professor Peter Singer, I think he's surely the most well-known philosopher in the world today. He's the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton. He's written widely on a wide variety of topics within bioethics as a leading proponent and advocate of utilitarianism, effective altruism, and animal rights. I think most of us who publish in this area would have cited Peter and are familiar with his books. And in 2012, he was appointed a Companion of the Order of Australia for his service to philosophy and bioethics. In September, just past, he won the Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture, which is an incredibly prestigious prize. Professor Charles Camosy, he's an Associate Professor of Theology and Social Ethics at Fordham University. Having received his PhD at the University of Notre Dame, Professor Camosy has been at the forefront of academic work and advocacy for the consistent life ethic. Peter and Charles, I believe, have a friendship spanning back over a decade. Charles first studied the classic texts of Peter, Practical Ethics, as a doctoral student, and realized that even though Peter was an atheist, he shared a lot in common with Catholic social teaching on issues such as our duties to the poor, moral concern for non-human animals. That led to a meeting, and eventually Charles wrote his book, Peter Singer and Christian Ethics, Beyond Polarization. They've co-presented at various conferences around the world on topics such as abortion, euthanasia, and animal protection. It's fantastic to have you both here at our inaugural conference. A very warm welcome to you all. Since you know each other so well, I'll try and keep out of the way and let you both talk. To begin with, perhaps you can explain how your interactions with each other over the last decade have influenced or changed your views. And we'll start with Peter, but feel free to take it wherever you want to go.
Thanks very much. Charlie has influenced me in various ways. I guess one of them is to try to persuade me that the somewhat negative views that I've taken of the teachings of the Christian Church, particularly the Roman Catholic Church with regard to animals, are not fully representative of all of the strands of that thinking. And I'll bear that in mind when I revise animal liberation, which is sort of a current project that I want to work on. So that's certainly one. I'd also like to mention that together with Charlie and a couple of other people, we organized a conference on abortion here at Princeton called Open Hearts, Open Minds, which was really interesting. And you know, Charlie's book about me is subtitled Beyond Polarization. And I think that conference really showed that you can have good communication beyond polarization if you bring people together with that sort of mentality that they're going to be open to listening to other people and discussing with them rather than simply attacking them. I remember we had a dinner at which we deliberately mixed up people from different perspectives on the table. And it turned out that we had put on the same table somebody who was running an abortion clinic and somebody who'd been picketing outside that abortion clinic. But they managed to talk to each other in a civil way. So that was really nice.
Well, in some ways, I wrote a book about this, so I have a lot to say, but I'll limit it to maybe these two things. First, obviously, his writing and passion and activism on animals is something that fundamentally changed my life. I am now the kind of person who organizes theologians to try to do Friends of the Court brief when we try to get Happy the elephant freed from the Bronx Zoo. I never would have imagined that as kind of what I'm about at all before engaging Peter's work. But rather than repeat things that I've said already in the past, maybe I'll say this, especially to kind of name our current moment here, at least in the United States, but I think it's true in many other places around the world. There seems to be not seems to be, there is a direct attack on the usefulness of the thing that we used to call the academic project, the idea of marshaling arguments and evidence and engaging with your interlocutors, and even those who really have a very, very different opinion than you. And the number of people who are willing to defend that is shrinking, and on all sides, not just both sides, all sides. And so one of the things that I've really appreciated about Peter over the years is his willingness to defend that, especially since he was a victim of that in many ways in various places when he was hired at Princeton, and then when he went to Germany a few times and a few other places. So I think it's important for those of us that are still committed to that project, band together, learn from each other, and stay in solidarity with each other. And I guess that's where I stand, most clearly aligned with him right now.
Perhaps this is a good time to mention the new journal, Peter, that you've started with a couple of other people, the Journal of Controversial Ideas.
Certainly, that does follow on from what Charlie was just saying. I am concerned about the attacks on freedom of thought and freedom of expression, including in the academy. And there have been a number of episodes that have disturbed me and disturbed a couple of friends, most particularly Francesca Minerva, who's someone who's written about abortion and infanticide and has had death threats as a result of that. And also Jeff McMahon, who's professor of moral philosophy at Oxford. And so we were talking about it. I think Francesca was really the initiator of the idea, but we were talking about what we could do about this. And Francesca had the idea of an academic journal that would be peer-reviewed and would require the standards of rigor and argument that we are used to in academic fields, but would allow people to publish under a pseudonym if they felt that they had ideas that were so controversial that they could result either in personal threats to them or in threats to their career prospects. So we have done that. We've had one issue. It's called, as you say, the Journal of Controversial Ideas. And if anybody's interested, please go and have a look. You'll find it online. It's an open access journal. There's no fee for either publishing in it or reading it. We welcome donations from supporters, but we're keeping above, we're keeping out of bankruptcy at the moment, and we are now building up towards publishing another issue, which will probably be sometime early in the new year.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit more about animal rights? Animal liberations, you've mentioned already, Peter. It's a pretty foundational text in the animal liberation movement. Charles, could you explain a bit more about what you've learned from Peter about our treatment of animals and our obligations as Christians? And I don't know, there's probably a little bit of relevance about the current COVID pandemic there, and meat eating and that kind of stuff. And Peter's also published an essay about COVID-19, I think, in the Why Vegan collection of essays. Could we have a chat about that?
Yeah, so I didn't have this language to use at the time, but in 2019, I published a book called Resisting Throwaway Culture. And throwaway culture works in multiple ways, but one of the ways that works most prominently, and Pope Francis has invoked this in many ways in multiple contexts, is that it hides kind of what's happening. It's not really a culture of death in the sense that John Paul II was talking about. It's more of a kind of on the down low discarding. And that's certainly the throwaway culture here was really, well, as it is for most people around the world, really good at hiding what was actually going on with how we treated animals, to me. And so reading Peter's work most prominently, or most foundationally for me, it broke through the throwaway culture that was hiding how we treat non-human animals, and dare I say, awoke me to a different way of thinking about these kinds of issues, and really found in my own tradition really important resources for thinking about this. And to invoke pandemics, I think it's an open question about obviously what caused the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think thinking about pandemics and about superbugs and other kinds of threats along those lines, a Catholic understanding of integral ecology and integral human development, where we think about all these things together, as opposed to, siphoning us off into ecological ethics on the one hand and bioethics on the other hand, and animal ethics on the other hand. But instead of thinking of these things integrally, we can see how the way we treat non-human animals in factory farms is directly connected, not only to climate change, but to obviously drug-resistant bacterial outbreaks, and perhaps the COVID-19 pandemic had something to do with animals. We don't really know, but this is, whether it does or not, these are foundational issues for human civilization to worry about. And if we siphon them off from how we think about economics, how we think about animal protection, how we think about bioethics, we'll miss a really important part of an integral picture that we need to see all at once together.
Thanks, Charlie. To pick up on the pandemic issue, I think it's clear that factory farms increase the risk of future pandemics, irrespective of the origins of the COVID-19 one. But if we go back to the previous pandemic, it was a swine flu pandemic, and it did kill the various estimates of up to 1.5 million people. I think the lower estimate is more like 300,000 or 400,000. And it clearly emerged from pig farms in North America. So I think there's no doubt that that can happen. And the CDC has said that 3 out of every 4 new or emerging infectious diseases that affect people do come from animals of one kind or another. And many scientists have said that, if you really wanted to breed new viruses, you'd put 10 or 20,000 animals into a single shed, put them under stress because of the crowding, and then let human workers go and move among them. And of course, that's exactly what factory farms do. So it certainly is a risk in that way. But also, for me, the reason that I stopped eating meat and started to become involved in trying to do something about this was just that it's a horror for the vast number of animals who are there. There's an estimate of something like 70 billion animals that are raised and killed for food. I should say land animals, because that doesn't include fish, which would make the number far larger. But 70 billion land vertebrate animals raised and killed for food each year, and the vast majority of them living miserable lives in factory farms. I see it as an ongoing horror, which people are still not enough aware about. In fact, I've been talking about that in my course here at Princeton just in the last week. And I've had students coming, there's a highly educated Princeton students, been through high school, got to an excellent university, and they say, I had no idea that, there were these factory farms that were like that. So there's still an educational process to go through with people.
Peter, could you talk just a little bit more about how the suffering of animals compares to the suffering of humans? Maybe throwing a little bit about utilitarianism there.
Yes, of course, really making that comparison is extremely difficult. I don't have a clear answer to that. But my view, and it is a view that, as you say, really goes back to Jeremy Bentham. Bentham has this famous footnote in his introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, where he's discussing the fact that the French at that time, it was written just after 1789, have discovered that the color of a man's skin is no reason for allowing him to be enslaved. And Bentham says, perhaps one day the time will come when we'll also recognize that whether a creature has fur or a tail is no reason for abandoning them to the caprice of a tormentor. And then he goes on to say, what else is it that would draw the insuperable line? Is it the capacity to reason or to talk? No, it's the capacity to suffer, he says. And I think that's right. That's the foundation of ethics. I'm not saying that being able to reason is not relevant. Of course, it's relevant to whether you can be a moral agent, but to whether you're a being to whom we have obligations. Seems to me the capacity to suffer is foundational there. Now, I think it's, you can ask where borderlines are, but I think, again, it's clear that vertebrate animals are capable of suffering. I think there are some invertebrates like an octopus seem to be also capable. But how does their suffering compare with ours? Well, it's hard to say exactly, because clearly everybody participating in this event, has cognitive capacities above those of any non-human animal. But we don't regard that as being a factor in discounting the suffering of our fellow humans. If we're talking about infants, for example, if we're talking about those with profound cognitive disabilities, we still are rightly very concerned that they not suffer in various ways. And we wouldn't say, well, yes, but they can't reason, so it doesn't matter. And I think the same has to apply to animals. Clearly, they can suffer. They do suffer in many really severe and lasting ways in factory farms, and not only in factory farms, other areas as well. And my view is that we should give that suffering the same weight that we would give to similar kinds of suffering if they occurred in humans. And as I say, there may be different kinds of suffering. There may be suffering because of our cognitive capacities. Existential angst, I guess, is something that can cause humans to suffer, but not non-human animals. But there are certainly overlapping kinds of suffering as well. And that's where I think the equal weight principle applies. And that's where, if we're harming these major interests of non-human animals in order to satisfy interests of ours that are not so significant, and I think whether we eat plant-based foods or meat-based foods, it's not insignificant, but it's not anything like as significant as what we're doing to the animals in the process.
And as Charles said, there is an overlap with climate change there too, isn't there?
There certainly is, yes. I think the current estimate is that about 14.5% of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere are coming out of the livestock industry. So that's a big component. It's not as big as fossil fuel use, but it's right up there after that.
Now, Charles, do you want to add a bit more about animal suffering? And I know you're from the Catholic tradition. It doesn't really seem to be much of a thing in the Protestant tradition. Have you got any comment to make on the contrast there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not that much a part of the Catholic tradition yet. There are those of us who are working on that. We do have some resources to work with. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, for instance, argues that we ought to treat animals with kindness, which I think is, in fact, it uses the verb to owe. So we owe animals kindness is the way the Catechism talks about it. And as I point out in Peter Singer and Christian Ethics, I think it's worth noting that the tradition has always been concerned with suffering and with consequences in particular. It's no accident that, in my view, that utilitarianism comes out of Christian England, and that there were some people like Paley and others who were explicitly Christian and also explicitly utilitarian, and they saw a way of trying to work that together. I don't agree with it, but at least I think that's indicative of something worth noting about a common ancestry, perhaps, of concern for suffering and for consequences. But there are, maybe I will say that, especially now with biotechnology, I do think there's a set of concerns that we need to focus on, which aren't related to suffering. In fact, some may in fact be related to mitigating suffering. So I think we're now starting to get to the point where we can sort of fool with non-human animals as the tools we've turned them into, to kind of reduce the chances they would feel the kind of suffering they might otherwise feel, or even eliminate it altogether. There are questions that a theologian will ask about how this relates to the will of God for that creature, or the kind of creature God created that being to be, that I think are important. But even apart from that, maybe you can understand that a little bit better because that's for the animal's sake. But I was on a panel recently with the National Academy of Sciences trying to work through their attempts to create disease models in animals for dementia. And what they're actually talking about are creating neurochimeras for animals that are yet to be determined, I guess. But presumably it could include things like everything from mice to pigs to monkeys to dogs, where they would actually create non-human animals with human cortexes, human frontal cortexes, as a means of creating, again, a disease model for dementia. Now, here I think we could talk about suffering as maybe part of the discussion, but I think there's a bigger question to ask here, or a more foundational question to ask about what our relationship with animals ought to be. What are we beholden when it comes to treating animals as the kinds of creatures that they are, versus treating them as mere tools? I often ask my students, are animals more like us? Are they more like pencils? And then we can go from there. We're treating them more like pencils. We're treating them more like tools for us to manipulate and use however we like. And I think if we can move in the direction of thinking of more as the kinds of creatures which we owe kindness, and also to which we owe respect for the kinds of creatures they are, those are resources we can use to kind of address the questions that the National Academy of Sciences in the United States were trying to explore there.
Charlie, I want to push back just a little bit on what you said about
Please.
The tradition, because as you know, as I said in An Animal Liberation, but it's surely still true that Aquinas, for example, specifically said we don't owe anything to animals. We can't sin against animals. The only reason why we shouldn't be cruel to animals is because we might develop a cruel disposition that will lead us to be cruel to humans. And that seemed to me to have a profound negative influence for many centuries. I'm not saying that it's necessarily still something that Catholics would endorse, but I do think that it held back concern for animals.
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't clear there. I was speaking more about, in general, about consequences and suffering, as opposed to specifically consequences and suffering for animals. And you're, of course, right to point out that, in my view, how bad Thomas Aquinas is on this question, though I'm not sure he had the best science on it, though I'm not sure you can't use also common sense in some ways to try to, but of course, he's not the only person, thinker to have this view, and it's certainly not a uniquely Christian mistake, though obviously that mistake had some consequences, if you will, that aren't great. But I will say this idea, though, that we owe God's creation a certain kind of respect, that we owe it a kind of reverence, even if we don't posit, and I don't think we should do this, if we don't posit some intrinsic value on the part of creation or animals, just our allegiance to God and to respecting God's will for creation puts a kind of impetus on us, an onus on us to at least ask questions that otherwise wouldn't be asked, it seems to me.
Sure.
So Charles, even though perhaps during the history of the church we haven't done such a great job looking after animals, there is a good basis for a grounding for that we should be looking after animals and caring for them as part of God's creation.
Yeah, I mean, it's just starting to emerge in the last decade or so in Christian theological circles and the Protestant tradition. David Clough, who I know Peter knows, we had a great conference at Oxford a few years ago where he spoke movingly about animals. It was titled Christian Ethics Engages Peter Singer. I still love that title, but he just came out in the last few years with 2-volume work on animals, which is just extraordinary. And he highlights a lot of these resources. So if anybody's interested, I really encourage you. It's thick. It's 2 thick volumes that are full of these resources. So I really commend that to anybody that's interested. But yes, the resources are there, and we just need to mine them at this point, it seems to me.
Charles, you mentioned Alzheimer's disease a little bit earlier, and I know that you recently published a new book that tries to bring a bit of a focus on that issue, losing our dignity. Could you tell us a little bit more about what your new book's about? And then Peter, could you kind of give a response to what Charles has told us?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm most concerned about in terms of our rejection of a traditional Christian moral anthropology is something that Peter would, of course, not see as a problem, as far as I know, but this loss of any kind of sense that we can call other human beings, that is fellow Homo sapiens, equal. In fact, I think, Peter, in Practical Ethics, you go through this question in some detail, trying to articulate what, in fact, it would be about us that would unite us as equal beings. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, you say something like our equal capacity to have preferences met, or I'll let you articulate it, but you may think differently now, given some
I would
shifts.
think now our equal capacity to have interests, to suffer or to enjoy life, but it would be something along those lines. Yes,
something along those lines.
Yeah.
But it's just and I learned. I mean, this was put in stark relief to me in engaging Peter's work on multiple levels. It's just clear that lots of human beings, Homo sapiens, do not have similar kinds of interests or preferences or capacities to suffer along these lines. And so we've seen the results of that. And my book is an attempt to say, since we've rejected that, and we've in fact, since we've kind of X'd out the ability to reference theological groundings of such equality, like sharing a common human nature that's made in the image and likeness of God, we've seen one population after another kind of fall out of the circle of protection. And the one that seems to be on the chopping block now, at least from my perspective, is human beings with later stage dementia, who either have lost or are on their way to losing rationality and self-awareness and capacities. And so I go into some detail in the final third of the book, actually, to think about this question and to propose ways to mobilize, both as individuals and communities, as those that want to dialogue with those who think differently, but especially as a church, and the church as to meet the challenge of, the number of people with dementia around the world is going to double over the next 20 years. It's going to triple over the next 30 years. The New York Times just came out with an expose showing we currently give antipsychotic drugs to people who don't need them in nursing homes because it keeps them docile and they feel like they don't have other good options because of our lack of staffing and other resources for people with dementia. So the problem is already very acute at the moment, and it's going to get dramatically worse over the next 20 to 30 years. And so if we can't make some progress as a culture that seems to be pushing in directions where these human populations would not count the same as us, I really fear we'll slouch first towards maybe robot care in inverted commas there, and then, or maybe even at a similar time, euthanasia or assisted suicide as part of the quote unquote solution to those problems. So that's a lot, and I could say more, but that's basically what I'm worried about, especially in the final third of that book.
Right. Well, I think at this point, our broad agreement that we had when we talked about animals does start to disappear, because certainly, let me just say, I accept that this is a problem. I accept that when we have people with dementia, they should be cared for well. We might differ a bit as to what caring for them well means. I am going to focus on things like, that they're not suffering, that they're enjoying their life as far as possible. You will probably talk more about their inherent dignity, and I'm not sure about that when somebody has really lost their capacities, and I'm familiar with this situation because my mother had dementia for her final years. But the thing that you mentioned at the end, which is euthanasia or medical assistance in dying, I regard as a positive. So in particular, I think of it as a positive that if somebody knows that they are diagnosed with dementia and doesn't want to go through those last years, then that should be their choice. They should not be forced into this, of course, but that should be their choice. I'm sure that it would have been my mother's choice because she was for many years a member of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society of Victoria, in the state in Australia where she lived. But at that stage, we had no medical assistance in dying. We do now have it in Victoria, but we don't have it except when somebody is terminally ill, and she would not have been terminally ill at the time when she could have made that choice. So I think we should be grappling with that question of either enabling people to give an enduring power of attorney, with some specifications about things. I've talked about this with my wife, for example, after we watched what happened to my mother. Her view is, she said, if I can't understand the front page of, she named the daily newspaper that we read in Australia. I don't really want to go on beyond that point. I'm not sure whether that would be my point, but there would be a point where I would think I don't want to go on either. And of course, there are a number of other people who think this way, and some of them have ended their life prematurely because they still had the capacity to end their life, and they didn't want to be in a situation where they couldn't do that. So they're prepared to sacrifice some months of good quality life or adequate quality life in order to avoid ending up in that state. I think that there will be some countries moving towards this kind of either giving people power of attorney or allowing people to sign documents that say that they would like to have assistance in dying, they would like to have their life ended at a certain point. And I don't see any real objection to that. Obviously you may come up with a different kind of objection, but from the perspective that I hold, it is respectful of the person because it respects their autonomous choice, and it reduces suffering if they are suffering. I think my mother probably at some points was suffering in the end, and it will enable better care of those people who don't wish for this, because as you just said, we already don't really properly staff these places where people are kept, and we give them drugs to keep them easier to manage. And if the numbers double or triple in coming decades, it's only going to get worse. But if people don't want to be in that situation, then why not allow them not to take up the staff resources that society is clearly not going to fund very generously anyway, and therefore provide better care for those who don't want to have that way out.
Charles, I'm sure you have got something you can say on that.
Now we're getting down to it. So I think it's worth noting here, one of the reasons that I really have benefited from engaging Peter's work, and I think others have too, is because he's just so clear about what follows from certain premises. And we've seen that on a number of issues, and this one is no different. And so for those who don't have his underlying metaphysical commitments or lack of metaphysical commitments, we ought to listen to what he just said, because I think that's very important for thinking about where this is likely to go in the future if the trajectory continues along the way it is. I don't see it, in fact, stopping. I don't think given the logic we've put in place when it comes to moral anthropology and in bioethics and in our legal regimes, most of our legal regimes in the West, I don't see a way of stopping it from going where he just articulated. It makes sense, actually, that it would go there. But if that is problematic, or even worse, horrifying, which it kind of is to me, we ought to heed that and think about how to engage in a way so we can avoid that outcome. And certainly part of the story, I think, has to be that we reorient our resources to care for people with moderate and later stage dementia in ways that wouldn't make it so likely that someone would say, well, I don't want to live in an institution drugged up and essentially that's in a warehouse of deaths and as I die alone, because that's going to do nothing but even accelerate the trends that Peter was just, if not articulating, at least hinting at. I do think it's worth noting, and this might get us into the weeds a little bit philosophically, I don't know. I think it's worth noting the case out of the Netherlands, which happened there was a legal decision about it, I think a few months ago. And maybe somebody here knows the details a little bit better than I do, but I think it went something like this. There was a woman in the Netherlands who developed moderate dementia. She requested physician-assisted suicide. And I think she said, even if I say I don't want it later, I still want it, so you still should do it. I think I got that part right. And then once she had developed more along the lines when her dementia developed more acutely, they again raised her family medical team raised this with her, and she said, well, I'm not ready for this yet, essentially. And they asked her a second time, and she said no, and a third time, and she said no. And if I understand the case correctly, the family and medical team put a drug in her coffee to sedate her, and then went ahead with the assisted suicide anyway. And aside from and I think the doctor and the medical team was found not guilty of anything for doing that. I think that raises a question about autonomous preferences and about what we should respect and who we should respect along the lines of something like that, and what cultural forces are in play that would lead someone to say I don't want this versus another person to say I do want this, and what kind of message are we sending about what kind of lives have value and what sort of lives do not, what sort of cognitive capacities are necessary to have a valuable life versus what kind of cognitive capacities, if you're lacking them, you're implicitly saying as a culture you might want to kill yourself. And Peter knows this better than anyone. He's had disability rights people come after him time and time again with making a similar kind of argument. But I think it's worth hovering on that for a moment, because I do think it's the case that policies that we put in place that seem neutral, like just giving a choice to somebody to do what they want, give an implicit, if it's not just for anybody to kill themselves for any reason, no matter what, if we limit the reasons, if we say only in these cases should we allow this, aren't we implicitly saying, well, we as a culture can kind of understand if you were in your situation, you might want to kill yourself if you were in this situation. And then that sends an implicit message, doesn't it, about what kind of value those who have lost the ability to read, say, the front page of the newspaper, it does send an implicit message to them about what kind of value their lives have, it seems to me. I think Peter disagrees with me about this, but I think it's worth mentioning.
Yes, I just mentioned on the Netherlands case, and I haven't brushed up my memory of the details either, so just taking your account of it as assume that that's accurate. I would not support giving somebody euthanasia when they're capable of understanding the question, are you ready for it now? And they answer negatively. That's not the situation that I was envisaging, though I agree that one can imagine that happening, and you could say that's going to happen sometimes if you allow this. But I think you could build into the legislation that if the person is competent to understand that question, then the no is a veto, and you wait until they're no longer competent. Certainly, as I say, again, referring to my mother's situation, for the last 6 months at least, I would say she wasn't competent of understanding anything or really speaking or recognizing myself or my sister when we came in. So there can be still quite a long time when somebody is being cared for after the point that was reached in that Dutch case, and that's a reason for thinking maybe the action was taken too soon.
Charles, do you think the pandemic has, with its squeeze on healthcare resources, has given us a bit of maybe a snapshot of the future in terms of how people are treated in some of these facilities? Yeah,
it just like Peter's work on animals kind of broke through throwaway culture for me personally. I think throwaway culture was similarly hiding from us as a culture and as individuals in many cases what's happening with our elderly and those who have dementia. And maybe pandemics really don't have silver linings, but maybe one good thing to come out of a pandemic like this is a kind of in your face, look at this, look how we're treating this population opportunity, right? For us to say, instead of just kind of pass it by, yeah, we kind of know something bad is going on in those places, and it would be better if they were leading different kind of lives, but I can't really be bothered to think about that, or it's too difficult for me to think about that. I would have to change my life dramatically, perhaps with family members and others, to think about if I really thought about the implications of this. Maybe the pandemic has given us a chance to, has sort of put it in front of us in a way that breaks through the cultural camouflage that throwaway culture provides for the discarding of people, and these people in particular, and given us a chance to say, whoa, wait a minute. If if this is what has been revealed, we need a foundational shift in how we do things. And I don't know what it was like, and I know this is an international conference. I don't know what it was like necessarily other places, but in the United States, there were tremendous numbers of people with dementia who died of something like neglect due to isolation, and not of COVID. Just the numbers of excess deaths, quote unquote, of people with dementia was just extraordinary. In fact, the CDC's director of mortality statistics responded to a Politico article inquiry into this by saying there's something going on and we need to find out what it is. He was just kind of stumped by this. But I think, if you just think about it for 2 seconds, it's not hard to figure out. People who are isolated with dementia just really decline very quickly, and they declined very quickly during the pandemic. And so the counterculture to a throwaway culture, as Pope Francis instructs us, is a culture of encounter, or the counterculture to a throwaway culture is a culture of encounter. And I really think we need to build that. We need to build, especially an intergenerational culture of encounter, where different generations aren't artificially separated off, but experience each other, encounter each other, embodied interactions, especially post-pandemic. I think that's going to be so important to build into a culture which has artificially separated those generations, it seems to me, for some time. But I could go on for that, but I'll just cut it off there.
Don't you feel, Charlie, that in the pandemic, we were faced with very, very difficult situations because we didn't have all the resources we needed? Say, for example, not just early on, it's happening again in some parts of the US, but certainly early on. So I think the clearest example was in northern Italy when the pandemic struck very hard, and they clearly did not have the intensive care beds that they needed, the ventilators they needed to help everyone. And they started making decisions, which I think are very tough decisions to make, but they were decisions basically along utilitarian lines to try to maximize the benefits out of those intensive care beds. So they abandoned the traditional rule, which was a first come, first served rule. So if you were in the ICU and the ICU was not completely futile for you, you would stay there, even if someone with better prospects had to be turned away. And the Italian doctors actually set up a committee that produced guidelines which said, no, we in this situation, we can't do this. We should make judgments about the likelihood of somebody surviving. So it is a kind of triage situation, the likelihood of somebody surviving if admitted. And if the likelihood is greater that they will survive if admitted, but they'll die if not admitted, we should admit them, even if that means taking somebody out who's maybe been in the ICU for a while, but is not making strong progress and would need the bed for a while further. And I thought that was interesting because to me, it did suggest that although there's a kind of a deontological medical rules about who gets these beds, when you're really under pressure, most people will look at trying to produce the greatest amount of good with the resources that they have.
Yeah, that's a slightly different point than the one I was making, which is about just what the pandemic revealed about elder care. But
sure, yeah, it's a different point. Yeah,
yeah, but I take your push, Benthamite. But I don't know. I mean, we certainly did move away from certain rules that were in place. But I didn't see us essentially doing a straight up no chaser utilitarian calculation in each circumstance or anything like that. Now, you'll probably argue that that's because that's not the best way to maximize consequences. We still need some rules in place. But for instance, we didn't do something like what, in fact, it was proposed at several points. In some cases, either implicitly or explicitly, we didn't do something like a quality adjusted life year analysis and say, well, if you, in fact, there were some states in the US who had protocols in place that explicitly invoked, quality of life or even disability. I think Alabama may have even said those who are, quote, mentally retarded had not the same, had access to care that others would have. And the Secretary for Health and Human Services, or the Office of Civil Rights in the Office of Health and Human Services really cracked down on those protocols and push them in a different direction. So it's not, I mean, it's not quite responsive to your point, but I just want to say that there was an attempt to really resist, at least in the United States, several means that were proposed to allocate scarce resources according to something like quality of life, that may have pushed back against that kind of impulse.
Right. It may be that quality of life is too difficult to assess for people who are in an emergency room admitting people to ICU. So I'm not particularly pushing that you do it at that place. I do think quality of life judgments have a role in decisions about allocation of healthcare resources, as to what kind of procedures may be done in general. But I agree, you do have to have rules when you're an admitting doctor in the emergency room.
Talking about the pandemic, Peter, I was wondering if you could just share with us your thoughts on maybe what we should have done or be doing differently during this pandemic, from a utilitarian point of view, maybe with vaccine allocations and things like that.
Yes, well, I mean, I guess there are issues with vaccine allocations, which I think should have gone to those who would benefit most from them. But that, in fact, was the evidence shows older people who were most at risk of dying. And even though it's true, from a life expectancy point of view, you could say from quality adjusted life years, if somebody who's 85 dies, they may be losing 5 to 10 life years. And if somebody who's 40 dies, they may be losing 40 or 50 life years. So you might say we should give the younger people priority. But in fact, when you look at the vastly increased risk of the older person dying, the calculation doesn't go that way. Charlie may not want to do a calculation at all, I don't know, but the risk was so great that it was good to give the vaccine first to older people. But the other example where what I think we did something wrongly is slightly different and worth discussing. And again, I don't really know what Charlie would say about this. When we had early candidates for vaccines, and I think Moderna in particular, we actually had a candidate vaccine as early as February, so quite early on in 2020. The procedures for testing it were the conventional ones. That is, that you give the vaccine to half of a sample of people, volunteers, and you let them go out in the community, and eventually enough of them will have been exposed to the virus in their daily lives so that you can look at your samples and say there's a statistically significant rate of benefit. Now, but that of course takes months because most people are not exposed to it all the time in their daily lives. So we lost a lot of time. What else could we have done? Well, there were a quite large number of volunteers who came out of the effective altruism movement. There was an organization set up called One Day Sooner, with the idea being that every day sooner that we get the vaccine will save thousands of lives. And that organization got 38,000 human volunteers who said, I'm willing to have a different kind of trial. I'm willing to be exposed to the vaccine deliberately. So, again, put me in a group where half of them get the vaccine at random, half of them get a placebo, and then expose us to the virus. Now, that's called a human challenge trial. If that had been done, I think we could have got vaccines months earlier and we could have saved a large number of lives. But generally speaking, the researchers and the medical profession were too conservative to actually take up those offers. There is now a trial that's been going on in England since early this year on a small group, which is hasn't really got fully underway. It's doing things about what vaccines might work if we have different variants of the virus. But I think, had it been taken up a lot earlier, it could have saved a lot of lives. And various people said, well, we shouldn't expose healthy people to risk. The risk was relatively low. It was younger people who were volunteering, so the risk to them was quite low. They would have been medically supervised. Clearly, after being exposed to the vaccine, they would have had to be in a quarantine facility. So the risk was very low, plus they were volunteers. Plus, and in a way, this is the basic point, if you don't do that, then you're exposing people to much greater risk without their consent. That is, the people in the community, particularly, of course, healthcare workers who had a higher rate of infection because they were more exposed to the virus. So they are involuntarily being exposed, and more of them are dying. So to me, this was a serious mistake in being reluctant to take up the offers of these consenting volunteers that could have saved a lot of lives.
I think we're back to agreement.
Got a comment? Yeah.
I think we're back to agreement, Peter. So
no, I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. So I think that was a big mistake. And there were lots of mistakes during the pandemic, but I think that was one of the major ones. And I think especially as long as it was truly volunteer and not remunerated, because then you can make an argument that perhaps there'd be some implicit sense that those who are more economically vulnerable would be pushed into this structurally or something like that. But if it's truly people who are exhibiting courage and a willingness to sacrifice, perhaps for the common good and the greater good, that is a deeply Christian impulse, in my view.
Just on this topic, I know in Australia and I believe in the US, vaccine mandates are a bit of a hot topic. And I was wondering if both of you could just comment on the ethics of vaccine mandates.
Yeah, I support mandates. I think that they are justified, at least for mandates in situations where people will expose others, and that's generally what's happening. If you're working in a situation where you're working with others, you have to get the vaccine. I would even extend that and say if you're going to restaurants, movies, perhaps even if you're using public transport, if that could be enforced. If somebody says, I don't want the vaccine, and so I'm going to go to the countryside and grow my own vegetables and support myself without much interaction with other people, that would be a different situation. But I think it's not, people have been saying this is a liberty issue, but I would go back to John Stuart Mill's famous essay on liberty, where he said, the state should not interfere with people for their own good, either physical or moral, except to prevent, but it may interfere to prevent harm to others. And if the vaccine lowers your risk of transmitting the virus to others, which it's clear it does, then this is a case where the state is interfering to prevent harm to others, to reduce the spread of the virus and to save lives. Are we still in agreement, Charlie?
No. I mean, I'm a full supporter of vaccines and got my family vaccinated as soon as we could be, and have tried to argue against those who wrongly, in my view, take the Catholic tradition to say this is because some of the testing was done on clone cells from an aborted child, that we ought not to use it for that reason. I think those are bad arguments. But one thing that I think is worth noting here, and I'm surprised we don't have more people talking about this, is we only have 1 year's worth of data about the results of this, right? We have widespread data on that, huge amounts of data on what happens after about a year. But that's not, I think fair-minded people could agree that's not enough time to really know about medium, to say nothing of longer term effects, so to compare it to other kinds of vaccines where we do have that longer term data just doesn't seem to be fair. So, and I do worry that people who, we as a culture, we maybe as a species during these kinds of pandemics and medical emergencies and other kinds of emergencies tend to be too quick, I think, to outsource our civil liberties to a government that I think with some reason is moving obviously to protect and the population. But we saw, at least in this country, during after 9/11, just the dramatic power that was taken up by the federal government and the civil liberties that suffered as a result. We can go to other kinds of pandemics even and other kinds of emergencies like war and others where the civil liberties are taken as a result of the kind of fear that people have, and in many cases, justifiably have. it certainly have a justification for that. But I think that should really be in the front of our mind when we think about this, right? So when in the United States, we just approved the vaccine, or vaccines for 5-year-olds who have about the same threat to COVID that they do from the flu. And what are we saying if we say that a 5-year-old who has virtually no risk themselves, if we don't really even have 2 years worth of data on what a vaccine does over time? I get that the 5-year-old is less likely to transmit the vaccine to somebody else. It's not as high a percentage, I think, as we originally thought, perhaps, and the vaccine's efficacy seems to wane over time. That said, I think everyone should get the vaccine. And I want to persuade people who think that they shouldn't, but I do think there's a reasonable person could say, I think there's a balancing of goods here, and until we have more data about at least medium-term effects of the vaccine, that a reasonable person could say, I think I ought to wait, especially for maybe younger people who are at virtually no risk. There's more to say about that, but I guess I'll just stop there.
Okay, have you got anything to add on that, Peter?
Not really. Yeah, I think the reason for vaccinating young people is to reduce the community risk, and insofar as it benefits them, it's probably not, I agree, from them not getting the virus themselves, but it's from the fact that they'll still be able to go to school, which, maybe if they get new waves of the virus, then schools are going to have to close down again. And I think that's certainly been one of the harmful effects of the lockdowns, which on the whole I've supported, but the disruption of education for children, especially disadvantaged children, is a real problem.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes left. I was wondering if we could just spend those last few minutes talking about effective altruism. Maybe, Peter, you could outline effective altruism, how the movement is going, where you see it heading in the future, and then Charles, you could comment on the overlap with our Christian obligations. Yeah, certainly. So effective altruism is a movement that got started in the early 2000s, maybe 2008 or something like that. To some extent, it obviously consists of two things. Altruism, I take it everybody here is familiar with what that is. It's trying to do things for others, make the world a better place in general. But what the effective altruism movement brought to that is the idea that with whatever resources we are using to make the world a better place, and unless we're saints, it's not 100% of everything we do, but it should be a significant part of our life aims. With whatever resources we're putting to that, whether it's money or time or skills, we should try to make sure that we get as much good as possible out of that. So just the general idea about value for money that everybody applies pretty much when they go and buy a new phone or laptop or car, that we apply that to charity as well. We think about which of the charities, if we've got money to donate to charities, which are the ones that will do the most good. And we look at that in a global perspective. We don't think, which are the ones that will do the most good in my local community, if I happen to live in Princeton, which is a reasonably affluent community in an affluent country. But we try to work this out globally. And for me, that meant trying to help people in extreme poverty wherever they are in the world. And I founded a charity called The Life You Can Save, which people can go to the website of thelifeyoucansave.org, and they can find charities that have been independently assessed as being highly effective, as giving you good value for your donations. So that's one part of the effective altruism movement. And it's the part, as I say, and of course, another part is to do things for animals. And again, there's something called animal charity evaluators that works out which are the organizations that are doing the most to reduce the suffering of animals. But, and I'd be very happy if the movement was focused around those two things. But there's a section of the movement now that has become quite significant, which says we should take a longer term view than that. And I don't disagree with this in principle. I think we should be thinking about the long-term future. But they see the greatest
threat to long-term utility as reducing risks of extinction of our species. And their point is that the extinction of our species would not just be the death of the, let's say, 8 billion people around at the time, but it would be the loss of all of those future, not just billions, but trillions, quadrillions, quintillions of people who will exist if we don't become extinct in the near future. And they imagine, for example, that we will populate other planets, and so the risk of extinction will diminish by quite a long way. So, you know, I take this seriously. I think it's worth putting some resources into this. But my current impression of where the movement's going is that there's perhaps a little too much emphasis on this, that it's not clear enough that we know how to reduce some of the risks that people discuss. For example, there's a lot of emphasis on people making sure that we don't develop an artificial general intelligence, a super intelligence that takes the planet over and gets rid of us. And I'm not sure how productive it is working on that at this stage, when we're still, I think, several decades away from producing such a super intelligence. So I'd really like the movement to go back a little bit to more concern for reducing suffering here and now, still with some concern about looking at the long-term risks, but not to the extent perhaps that the movement does that today.
Charles, are you familiar with the movement?
Yeah, yes, very much so. I realize we're already over time here, but I'll just briefly say two things. One, the overlap between traditional utilitarianism and Catholic social teaching, or even the broad social teaching of the Christian churches, is one of the most powerful examples of, or one of the more powerful exhibits for the thesis that there's a common lineage here that's important to highlight, and also portends well for common ground. There's in fact Christian groups in support of effective altruism that I'm part of, and that I've reached out to and are very interesting. I will just finally say, back to the idea that a culture of encounter is the antidote to a throwaway culture. We don't need to choose between the good of encounters with others and these goods that are more consequentialist in nature, because it seems to me one thing we've learned as a result of all this work with effective altruism is its relationships with those who are most in need that are best at producing effective, to emphasis on effective altruism on their behalf. And so instead of sweeping in, with big multinational organizations telling local groups what they want, the best and most effective altruism in those has been those that are actually going to have genuine embodied encounters with those that need aid, and that results in the best interventions, it seems, to help them.
And Peter, is there anything you'd like to just tell us to wrap up the session, and then Charles?
Well, thanks very much. Firstly, I'm really glad that we've had this discussion, and I think it has been an informative one. And again, it's shown, I'm not at all surprised about this, because I know Charlie, but it's shown that we can have civil discussions across fairly deep intellectual differences. So that's welcome. And I totally join with Charlie's view about the importance of, or the overlap with Catholic social teaching and with the utilitarian view. And I hope that people of good hearts and different ideas everywhere will join me in trying to reduce the suffering both of animals and of people living in extreme poverty. And I've indicated some ways in which you can do that. So I think it's also important when we talk about philosophy to have some follow-up and to act, and that this should really change our lives as well as our minds.
Thank you, Charles.
And I should thank Callum Miller, by the way, for organising this, because he's the person who first got in touch with me, and he's behind the scenes now, maybe, but I think he's done a fine job in getting this together.
Yes, thank you, Callum. I'll just repeat what I said earlier, and maybe this is just too much on my mind. There are increasingly fewer and fewer places where these kinds of conversations can happen. And so thank you for creating a space for this to happen. And thank you, Peter, for being willing once again to engage. I know I'm going to see you in person on Monday. We're going to talk in front of your students about, we managed not to talk about abortion at all somehow over the last hour. So we'll change that on Monday. But I really appreciate the chance to have a good old fashioned, more typical academic discussion and just discussion at all about these things. It's really refreshing.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you both. It's been a real honor and privilege to have you both here. For me, my mother was an animal behaviorist who has had Peter many years ago speaking to her students, and so she was very, very pleased to hear about this this conference.
Good. Thanks very much for hosting, chairing it.
Yeah. Thanks, Callum, for putting it all together. And we're about ready to finish the session, and we'll be meeting again in about just over 50 minutes time for our further session. So thanks everyone for listening. And we are recording the session, so it will eventually be available on YouTube. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Peter.